At least 6 West Africans who were deported from the United States to Ghana have been transferred to Togo despite mounting a legal challenge against their further deportation.
It didn't make global headlines. There were no flashing alerts, no emergency briefings. But somewhere between Washington, Accra, and Lomé, 6 Africans simply vanished, deported from the United States to Ghana, and then quietly transferred to Togo, a country 3 of them had never even seen. No documents, no explanation, just gone. And the world stayed silent. Ghana called it cooperation. The US referred to it as immigration enforcement. But Africans who've seen this game before called it what it truly is, a modern-day rendition, the outsourcing of Western guilt to African soil. So the question is simple: when did Africa agree to become America's dumping ground? And more importantly, what happens to a continent that forgets to say no? Let's find that out. A U.S. military aircraft landed quietly on the tarmac in Accra, Ghana, its doors sliding open not for soldiers or diplomats, but for deportees. 11 West Africans were on board, shackled by paperwork, politics, and a policy that saw them as liabilities rather than lives. America called it routine repatriation, but nothing about what followed was routine. The men were flown out of U.S. detention centers under an immigration program buried inside a secretive enforcement agreement with Ghana. Washington needed someone to take the unwanted. Ghana needed to stay in Washington's good graces. So the deal was done. No parliamentary debate, no press conference, just quiet signatures and an aircraft fueled by silence. When the plane landed, Ghanaian immigration officers received the men as if they were cargo shipments. They were detained immediately. No interpreters, no lawyers, no clear charges. Among them were electricians, mechanics, small business owners, and people who had lived years in the United States before being uprooted overnight. They weren't criminals. They were human beings who had run out of luck in an unforgiving system. Then came the twist. Barely a week later, 6 of those 11 men were gone. Transferred again, this time from Ghana to neighboring Togo. No explanation, no legal process, not even confirmation of their nationalities. 3 of them weren't Togolese at all, but to the bureaucrats shuffling papers, that didn't matter. Their lawyers were still in court in Accra, arguing that their detention was unlawful. The case was ongoing. The High Court hadn't ruled. Yet before dawn, Ghana's immigration service quietly handed the 6 men over and escorted them out of the country. By sunrise, their names had vanished from the system. That single act, deporting people while their case was still under judicial review, wasn't just procedural misconduct, it was a constitutional betrayal. It told the world that Ghana's courts could be bypassed, its sovereignty discounted, and its citizens silenced when Washington was involved. It told Africans everywhere that the rule of law stops at the edge of Western interest. And make no mistake, this wasn't just about those 6 men. It was a message that Africa's borders are open not for its people, but for foreign orders. A signal that even in 2025, the continent can still be used as a geopolitical warehouse for Western guilt. Ghana's government responded with the same polished vagueness that diplomats use when they know the truth will burn. Ghana continues to cooperate with international partners on migration management translation. We did what we were told. But cooperation with whom and for what? The U.S. had framed the program as part of its African Repatriation Support Initiative, an administrative phrase so bland it hides the horror beneath it. In reality, it's a system that allows Washington to relocate deportees to countries willing to take them temporarily, regardless of citizenship. Ghana was the experiment. Togo became the consequence. Across Accra, human rights lawyers were stunned. This wasn't deportation, it was rendition repackaged in diplomatic language. They accused the government of violating both domestic law and international convention. Opposition politicians demanded that the agreement be made public, but the government refused, saying it was a classified bilateral understanding. Classified? In a democracy? That's when it became clear, this wasn't a migration story. It was a story about power. And the question echoing through every newsroom, university hall, and parliament corridor became louder. If Ghana, one of Africa's most stable democracies, can secretly bend its laws to please Washington, what chance does the rest of the continent have? The world may see this as an immigration headline, but Africans see it for what it is, a test. A test of whether sovereignty still means something, or whether it's just a word we print on passports while someone else controls the flights. Because 6 men didn't just vanish between Ghana and Togo. They vanished into the space where Africa's dignity should have been protected. And that disappearance demands answers. The next question, then, isn't about who these men were. It's about what kind of system allowed this to happen, and who built it. To understand how 6 Africans could vanish without a trace, you have to look not at airports, but at signatures, the ones inked in back rooms where sovereignty is traded like stock. That's where this story truly begins, in an agreement so quiet, even Ghana's parliament never saw it. The document exists, a memorandum of understanding between the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and Ghana's Ministry of the Interior. Its language is the kind that sounds harmless in press releases but hides sharp edges in every clause. It speaks of migration management, humanitarian cooperation, and temporary reception of African nationals. But buried deep inside, there's a line that changes everything. Ghana agreed to receive and facilitate the transit of persons of African descent, removed from the United States, not Ghanaian citizens, not verified nationals, just persons of African descent. That single phrase reopened a colonial wound that never fully healed. The idea that Africa is one borderless holding pen where anyone with black skin can be dropped off and forgotten. It's a loophole disguised as generosity. And it's the very mechanism that allowed the U.S. to send people with unclear citizenship to Ghana, and for Ghana to quietly pass them on. How did such a deal even make it onto paper? The answer lies in Washington's post-2018 immigration doctrine. Under Donald Trump's America First agenda, deportations became political theater. The administration wanted to show toughness at home, but also competence abroad. To achieve both, it needed willing partners in the global South, countries that could absorb migrants and, in return, receive diplomatic praise or preferential aid. For years, U.S. diplomats toured African capitals promising technical assistance and border management training. The phrase sounded benign, even progressive, but in reality, it meant one thing. America wanted places to dump its deportees without headlines or legal complications. Ghana, desperate to maintain its status as Washington's trusted democracy, was first in line. Inside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the proposal sparked quiet unease. Some officials reportedly warned that accepting non-Ghanaian deportees could breach both the 1951 Refugee Convention and Ghana's own Immigration Act. But dissent in diplomacy is often buried under politeness. By the time the MOU reached cabinet level, it had been reframed as a strategic cooperation initiative. The moral problem was scrubbed out, the political benefit polished up. In Washington, the deal was hailed as a success. Homeland Security officials publicly commended Ghana for its leadership on African migration solutions. Behind the praise was relief. The U.S. had just outsourced one of the most controversial parts of its immigration system to an African partner, and done so without scrutiny. But there was more to it. The deal wasn't simply about deportees, it was about data. Embedded in the partnership was a clause allowing information exchange on identity verification. In practice, that meant Ghana granted the U.S. access to immigration databases, fingerprints, and personal records of detainees. It turned Ghana's immigration system into a remote extension of Homeland Security, an invisible tether stretching across the Atlantic. None of this was presented to the Ghanaian public. The MOU was classified under national security interest. Even Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee only learned of it after the first flight landed. By then, the damage was done. The U.S. had its precedent. Ghana had its quiet compliance. And for the Africans caught in the middle, that piece of paper became a death sentence for their identity. They weren't Americans, not recognized as Ghanaians, and never claimed by Togo. They belonged nowhere, the direct consequence of an agreement that treated people as policy outcomes. This is how cooperation turns into control, not through invasion, but invitation. A handshake, a signature, and suddenly a sovereign African nation becomes the staging ground for someone else's laws. Now the question that follows is bigger, heavier, and impossible to dodge. Why didn't anyone stop it? Where were the voices meant to guard the continent's dignity? The African Union? ECOWAS, the Pan-African institutions built to prevent precisely this kind of foreign manipulation? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Every injustice survives in silence, but this one thrived on it. When news of the US-Ghana deportation deal surfaced, not one African institution raised an eyebrow. No condemnation from the African Union, no emergency session from ECOWAS, not even a press statement from Ghana's own parliament demanding clarity. The silence was not ignorance, it was deliberate. The truth is uncomfortable. Africa didn't just allow this to happen, parts of it enabled it. Because over the years, the continent's political architecture has been quietly wired to Western funding. From migration programs to border security projects, much of Africa's sovereign policy is financed by the same powers that once colonized it. The AU's Migration and Displacement Division, for instance, receives major funding from the European Union and the International Organization for Migration, both heavily aligned with US migration objectives. When the hand that pays your bills violates your people, do you bark or bow? That's the trap. African institutions are caught in a moral debt, one that forces them to choose between integrity and funding. So when 6 Africans vanished between borders, officials who might have spoken out instead reached for diplomatic vocabulary. Ongoing consultation, interstate coordination, shared responsibility, words that sound professional but mean nothing. Yet silence has consequences. Every time Africa fails to protest, it reinforces the idea that its people are disposable, that a deportee can be tossed anywhere on the continent and someone will take the blame quietly. It transforms sovereignty into ceremony, something leaders parade in speeches but surrender in practice. This isn't new. The same script played out when Europe outsourced its border policing to North Africa. Countries like Libya and Tunisia accepted billions to detain and block African migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean. Detention centers turned into torture chambers. Reports emerged of slavery, rape, and forced labor, yet not a single African government called it what it was: a human rights catastrophe funded by Europe. Instead, they called it migration partnership. And now the United States has copied the same playbook, testing it in West Africa. Ghana's silence isn't isolated. It's symptomatic of a broader pattern where Western powers dictate and African states rationalize. When the deportations to Togo occurred, Ghana's opposition demanded that the government suspend the deal until Parliament could review it. The government refused. It feared that questioning the United States might strain diplomatic relations. That phrase, strain diplomatic relations, has become the modern leash of the empire. It's how African leaders explain away the betrayal of their own people. But silence doesn't just protect the guilty, it reshapes the narrative. Western media framed the deportations as a joint operation for orderly migration. African officials parroted the same line. And so a violation of human rights was rebranded as administrative success. This silence also exposed the deeper hypocrisy of Pan-African politics. The same African Union that lectures about continental unity was missing when Africans needed unity most. The same ECOWAS that threatened sanctions over coups couldn't even summon a statement over extrajudicial deportations. When Western interests are threatened, Africa finds its voice. When African dignity is violated, it finds its excuses. But there's another layer to this silence, one born not of fear, but fatigue. Many African leaders have internalized the belief that protesting Western injustice is futile. They've seen what happens when small nations resist, aid freezes, sanctions appear, and ambassadors call. So, they wait for the storm to pass. But silence doesn't end storms, it feeds them. What Africa doesn't realize is that every unchallenged act becomes a precedent. The deportation deal with Ghana wasn't the last, it was the first. Similar migration cooperation agreements are already being negotiated quietly with other African countries. The logic is the same. America provides support. Africa provides silence. And that's how a continent turns into its own jailkeeper, guarding Western interests against its own people. But silence can't last forever, because beneath it, resentment grows. African citizens are no longer blind. They see the contradictions, the hypocrisy, the puppet strings behind the smiles. And when that awareness reaches critical mass, silence becomes noise, and noise becomes defiance. The question now is, what happens when that defiance finally erupts? Because history shows that when Africans are pushed into corners, they don't stay quiet forever. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Every empire learns to adapt. Colonialism once used chains and ships. Modern imperialism uses policies and planes. The difference is just branding. What the United States built under its migration policy isn't law enforcement, it's logistics. It's an entire global system designed to clean its conscience while exporting its chaos. To understand it, we have to start in Washington, not at the airports, but in the offices of the Department of Homeland Security. After 2018, America faced a moral crisis of its own making. Detention centers overflowed, lawsuits piled up, and footage of migrant children in cages began damaging the country's image abroad. So policymakers needed a cleaner way to deport, something that could remove people without leaving fingerprints on the news cycle. That's when external processing became the golden idea. If the US couldn't legally deport a person to their home country, it could transfer them to a friendly nation that would handle the rest. The public would hear about partnerships, not pipelines. The blame would disappear across borders. Africa, especially West Africa, was the perfect testing ground. It had weak migration oversight, financially dependent institutions, and governments eager for diplomatic approval. Washington didn't need to force compliance. It could buy it with words like capacity building, training, and technical cooperation. And so, deportation became diplomacy. Homeland Security rebranded its controversial policies as joint humanitarian missions. American military aircraft were repurposed as transport for migrants, not soldiers, because nothing says soft power like using hard power to disguise it. The same aircraft that once delivered weapons to conflict zones now delivered human beings to political allies. But what made the system powerful wasn't its secrecy, it was its deniability. Each actor could claim innocence. The US could say it only facilitated repatriation. Ghana could say it cooperated in good faith. Togo could say it received on humanitarian grounds. And the migrants, the actual human beings at the center, had no standing to sue anyone. They were erased by paperwork before they could even protest. Here's the deeper cruelty. This network of migration partnerships wasn't limited to deportations. It became a tool for global leverage. The US began linking migration compliance to trade access, security training, and even student visas. Countries that refused deportation flights saw their visa approval slowed, their military aid questioned, and their diplomatic channels frozen. Countries that complied were praised for leadership. This is how the machinery works: punishment for defiance, obedience, and praise. It's the same colonial mechanism, only now it's operated through bureaucracy instead of bayonets. And make no mistake, this system isn't collapsing yet because it's useful. Not just to the US, but to other Western powers too. The European Union already uses African territory as an external border. Now the US has joined the game. The Sahel, the Gulf of Guinea, and even East Africa are being mapped not for development, but for detention routes. The geography of exploitation has simply changed form. Yet cracks are showing. Civil society in Africa is starting to connect the dots, realizing that this isn't migration control, it's containment. It's the modern Berlin Conference, but instead of carving territories, they're carving human mobility. And as more African nations shift toward independent foreign policies, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the old model is losing traction. Because a government that no longer fears losing aid is a government the West can't control. That's what Washington fears most, a continent that refuses to be the back end of its border system. But every empire that builds its foundation on fear eventually faces revolt. America's migration empire is no exception. The silence that once protected it is breaking. Lawyers are exposing documents. Journalists are tracking flights. and ordinary Africans are beginning to see the pattern that the same powers who preach democracy use deportation as their diplomatic weapon. The illusion is fading, the mask is slipping, and the empire is starting to look exactly like what it once claimed to destroy. So now the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when Africa finally refuses to play along? That roar has begun. Quiet at first, in courtrooms, universities, and underground press rooms, but it's growing louder with every revelation. What happened in Ghana wasn't an isolated scandal. It was a spark that lit up the entire conversation about who really owns Africa's destiny. For too long, the continent's dignity has been treated like a renewable resource, something Western powers could extract, manipulate, and rebrand at will. But this time, Africans noticed. And once people begin to see the pattern, obedience collapses. Across West Africa, human rights lawyers, student unions, and civil society networks have started connecting dots that governments hoped would stay scattered. They see that migration control is no different from the old tools of extraction, only now, instead of gold or oil, it's human movement being regulated for profit and politics. In Accra, a coalition of young lawyers has launched a campaign called Africa Belongs to Its People, demanding full disclosure of the US-Ghana agreement. In Lagos, activists have petitioned ECOWAS to establish a regional tribunal on forced deportations. Even in Togo, the same country that accepted the vanished six, journalists have begun investigating who authorized their transfer and under whose pressure. This wave of defiance isn't about outrage alone. It's about reclaiming control, intellectually, politically, and morally. For decades, African foreign policy has been dictated by survival. Survival of aid, survival of diplomacy, survival of image. But something has changed. Africa has new role models now, leaders and movements proving that sovereignty can exist without permission. Look at the Sahel. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger broke away from France's orbit, expelled foreign troops, and began redefining what independence looks like in the 21st century. They didn't wait for permission, they simply acted. The same logic is starting to spread. If nations can reject foreign militaries, why not reject foreign deportations? The lesson is simple. The moment Africa realizes it doesn't need validation to be legitimate, the system breaks. And Washington, Brussels, and Paris all know it. That's why they call these nations uncooperative or radical, because defiance threatens the illusion that the West still sets the rules. But the reckoning isn't just political, it's generational. A new African youth refuses to inherit the politics of politeness. They're digitally armed, globally connected, and deeply aware of how propaganda operates. They watched as Western media called their revolutions instability, their protests chaos, and their self-determination anti-democratic. Now they're telling their own story, on their own platforms, in their own words. And in their voices, one idea keeps returning. Africa owes the West nothing. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, the tone is shifting. The deportation scandal has become shorthand for a larger awakening, the realization that partnerships without respect are just colonialism with better PR. You can feel it in the language. Politicians who were once afraid to question US or EU policy are now publicly demanding transparency. Diplomats are starting to hint, cautiously but clearly, that Africa will no longer serve as a geopolitical landfill for failed Western agendas. And while governments move slowly, the people are moving fast. Grassroots networks are calling for continental protocols that forbid accepting deportees without verified citizenship. Academics are drafting new migration frameworks centered on African dignity rather than Western convenience. Media outlets, once hesitant to challenge power, are running investigative series connecting deportations to broader issues of sovereignty and neocolonialism. This is what awakening looks like. Messy, loud, unfinished, but unstoppable. And yet, for every action, there will be backlash. The West won't let go easily. Aid may be threatened, visas delayed, and funding frozen. But this time, Africa has leverage too. Resources, population, partnerships with Asia and Latin America, and an emerging collective consciousness that no amount of sanctions can suppress. The deportation scandal was meant to be a small operation, a footnote in an American policy document. Instead, it has become a mirror forcing Africa to see its reflection clearly. Proud, betrayed, and done with silence. Because this isn't just a story about 6 deported men. It's a story about a continent reclaiming its right to draw the line. And when Africa draws that line, history shifts. The world's balance of power begins to tremble. Because the truth is simple, the West can't keep its empire if Africa stops agreeing to be its border. So yes, this is the reckoning. The quiet era is over. The roar has begun. And this time, the world will hear it, loud, clear, and unafraid. How long will Africa keep calling exploitation cooperation? When will silence stop being diplomacy and start being betrayal? Let us know in the comment section. If the West keeps drawing the lines, will Africa ever truly be free? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.